Biggest news for today is Ukraine is going to receive an additional 49 M1A1 Abrams main battle tanks, but at the same time there is bad news for them as well, because North Korea supposedly is ready to enter combat with a battalion, which is more of a brigade size of 3,000 men. We'll talk about this as well as about Zelensky's peace plan, which he has just introduced the Ukrainian Rada to in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. In the night from the 13th to the 14th of October, for the first time in 48 days, no Shahid attack was flown by the Russians, but the next day the attacks immediately continued again. There have been additional strikes on ships in Odessa as well. So far, since the beginning of October, there have been at least 5 strikes, and at least 2 additional ships were hit in the harbor of Odessa. Also, the Rasputitsa has now begun. That's the mud season. This picture just to illustrate it. I've read it from Russian mill bloggers as well. So the mud season has begun, where traveling off-road with wheeled vehicles and even with tracked ones will be increasingly difficult. Let's switch to the developments along the front line. We have the Russians claiming that they captured Novi Put. This is the town down here in the Glushkovo district. According to them, they've captured it and pushed the Ukrainians out completely out of the Glushkovo district, which is here. So far, I do not see any visual evidence of this, so this might be true, this might not be true. The Russians have been somewhat successful in the east of the oblast, though. We see them here right southwest of Ruskaya Konopelkaya. And on the map, this is here. Ruskaya Konopelkaya, and the Russians have reached this point here at this point. So not a massive advance, but they are pushing now from the eastern side as well. The Russians have said, especially the Chechen general there, that the Russians have by now recaptured 50% of what the Ukrainians had taken in territory in the Kursk Oblast. So far, I cannot confirm this. I do not see this. Even if we believe the Krymy Caprice map, for instance, even then we are only looking at a front line roughly like this here, and even that, the rest of this would not amount to just 50% of where the Ukrainians had advanced. We switch over in the direction of Kharkiv, and while fighting is continuing, and while I cannot see any change in territory, we have an interesting observation directly north of Kharkiv, here in the territory of Russia. There, the Russians attacked, you see here, Kharkiv in the south, here. We see Russians have attacked there and were struck by Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians were situated in here. So we see that the Ukrainians seem to have permanent positions inside of Belgorod Oblast as well, even though the distance is a mere few hundred meters. So that's not a significant advance into the Russian territory, but it seems the Ukrainians have taken positions inside of Russia in Belgorod as well. Let's switch over to the front line in the east, and there we have the Russians in Krylyakivka at the Oskil. This down here, the Russians have been advancing here, and we have them here in this position now. This, as you can see, is right next to the Oskil and roughly 500 meters away from the road to the north. The Russians are already down here on the tree line, but now they have entered the first towns of Krylyakivka. They are in the first houses here and seem to have taken a foothold in there, which means they are technically in the town now. Whether the Ukrainians can still operate northwards is unclear as of now. This is a railroad track, so maybe with some off-road vehicles on it, but the road itself is a mere 500-600 meters away from the furthest Russian positions, and what I've shown you was roughly here at this point. And as you can see, for the Ukrainians to advance north, they would have to use this road now, which is really close to the Russian positions. Further to the south, we have the Russians advancing north of Nevske. They are clearly aiming to connect Makivka and Nevke east of the Sherebets River, and we have a geolocation a little bit north of Nevske, so they are advancing towards the north from their current positions. South of the Seversky Donetsk, I do not see any change in Seversk or around Chasiv Yar. Nothing seems to have changed here. So we switch over right to the direction of Donetsk. Here we had a Ukrainian counterattack because artillery shelling is showing us that the Russians have shelled this position, which seems to indicate that the Ukrainians are at this point here. Probably advancing from this direction, maybe with the aim to cut the Russians off along this way here, but it shows that the Ukrainians are active inside of Donetsk and are still doing counterattacks inside of the area. A change in territory I cannot confirm at this point. We just see the Ukrainians having entered here. So apart from that, I guess we should turn the contested area roughly like this here, maybe even a little bigger, but overall nothing else has changed from what I've seen. West of it, north of New York, we have a Ukrainian counterattack on Russian positions. This is right to the northwest of the town. This means the Russians are being attacked here at this point again. The Russians have recently advanced up to here, and the Ukrainians are counterattacking. The Azov regiment has the 12th Assault Brigade, I think, is there, that is doing counterattacks there and having at least partial success. Further south, we are going to the direction of Pokrovsk. Here we have no advance towards Pokrovsk itself. The Russians have recently advanced along the railroad line here. In the last situation report, I showed you that the Russians were here, and they are solidifying. They continue to solidify their control over the railroad line and are slowly advancing towards the north, and thus obviously threatening to encircle Selidove at this point. Further south, the Ukrainians now confirm the loss of Ostrivske. I already said that in last situation report, so from my point of view, nothing has changed here at this point. So we'll switch down further to the direction of Vodiane, in the direction of Vuhledar. There we have another change in territory. The Russians have now been spotted here. Now, all of those are minor changes, to be perfectly honest. This is now showing being contested. We had the Russians here lately, and now we have them here. So they are pushing in this direction and managed to enter the tree lines here, but overall not a significant change in the control here. West to the in the western west of this area, south of Velika Novosilka, where the oblasts of Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia meet, the Ukrainian deep state map is now admitting that the Russians have roughly gained this territory here. They have now come close to Levatne, and the Ukrainians admit that it is contested by now. As far as I'm concerned, I have the Russian claims that Levatne was taken. We had, in last situation report, we had Ukrainian mill bloggers admitting that they had to draw back at this point. Whether Levatne is taken by the Russians at this point, or whether it's contested, or whether it's still held by the Ukrainians, I cannot say. So we have to take this map here as a minimum as of now, even though I do not see Russian claims that they have advanced significantly further than this. So this is probably somewhat close to the current developments. We have reports about fighting west of this, fighting towards the Orikhiv, especially here in the direction of Verbove, is an increased activity of the Russians, so probably roughly in this direction here. We see Russian activity, but so far no confirmation of any successes, and the Ukrainians are reporting that the Russians intensified their operations in the Dnipro Delta down here. Again, at this point, no change in territory that can be confirmed though. Overall, we have interesting developments both in Kursk, initially in Kursk. There was a report that dragon teeth, so the anti-tank obstacles, have appeared in Kursk on the roads, and Russian military personnel has run into them because they didn't expect them there. They are driving with low light at night to avoid being hit by drones, and they're driving fast, and then they are suddenly hitting those concrete pillars weighing several hundred kilos. This is an image of how it looks when one of those cars is running into one of them. The interesting part is the Russians have no idea what this is, how this came to be, as those pillars are expected to be too heavy to simply be carried around. So somebody is placing them there, and either it's complete disorganization on the Russian side, that somebody is placing tank obstacles on resupply routes, or it's sabotage to a certain degree. And the second one would at least be likely when we come to this here. This was taken according to here, War Translated. This was taken on the Crimean Peninsula. There again, a dragon teeth was positioned on the middle of the road, several hundred kilometers, 170 kilometers from the front line. So in this case, it must be sabotage at this point, even though we do not know what happened in the region of Kursk, but it's happening there for several days already. And we have here Boris Roshin saying, I think, yeah, Boris Roshin confirms that people have died and have been wounded, as well as vehicles have been destroyed or damaged due to this practice of suddenly dragon teeth appearing on the road. We have sabotage activity as well. A Russian Tupolev 134 plane has burned in the town of Orenburg. We see it here, that the fire is inside of the plane, and we see at some point, you can see somebody actually showing his hand. So here, maybe you see it, like the Manus Cornuta is showing in front of it. So the GOR is claiming that it did the sabotage, and at least the person taking the picture must have enjoyed the sight, so it might have been the person doing the sabotage. The Russians are reporting, the Ukrainians are reporting on the other side, that the Russians try to recruit children to do sabotage inside of Ukraine, but that would be, and they're obviously outraged about this, but to be perfectly honest, we had recently a case where 2 Russian children were recruited through Telegram to burn down a helicopter, and they successfully did though. So in this case, it might just be the Russians doing the same that the Ukrainians might have done before, even though it's obviously not correct, and I'm pretty sure it's against the rules of law to recruit children as saboteurs, even though it's over the internet. That won't change anything about this. But the bigger news is what the Kiev Independent is reporting here. Russia is already hosting 10,000 North Korean soldiers, according to the reports here. And we have Ukrainian media saying that the Russians are forming a battalion of North Korean citizens on the basis of I think a VDV brigade that will soon go enter the combat in Kursk as soon as it's finished. Now, battalion is the wrong size because they are talking about 3,000 men. That's more brigade size, but supposedly 3,000 North Korean soldiers are preparing to engage the Ukrainians inside of Kursk, so in the northern front area at this point here. There are some claims that 18 North Korean soldiers have already deserted, and they are being looked after right now, but I have not seen any conclusive proof of this, so this might be true, this might be propaganda, even though there's some credibility to this at least. We have to say, though, this is not a sign of strength. It shows that Russia is not capable of filling its personnel demands to the degree it wants its personnel demands to be met with the means it's capable of taking. I made a video about this. I mentioned it a couple of times already in the past, where it shows that Russia has personnel trouble, even though it's several times as large as Ukraine, because the fact that you still have men doesn't mean you can't simply turn them into soldiers. And this is something Russia is struggling with. And this has reached a point where they are apparently drawing on North Korean personnel to meet their personnel demands. Supposedly, and this has to be taken that this is so far, I have not seen any serious quote of it. It's a bigger Twitter channel that posts articles or the contents of articles without ever referencing them, where it's coming from. But he's currently sharing that South Korea has claimed they will send direct military aid to Ukraine if North Korean soldiers are entering the fight. As said, as of now, this might be the truth. I was not able to confirm it because, unfortunately, a lot of the so-called OSINT channels on Twitter are just copying something from Telegram or copying press reports, the press headlines, and posting them without any reference to where they got it from. And this is their OSINT work. But this channel is claiming that South Korea said they're going to send direct military aid. I used Google, obviously, trying to find the source, and I was not able to. Maybe in the next situation report we'll have more details here. So as of now, this should not be taken as a fact when we come to this point. Then we have a Ukrainian soldier saying that the Shahid have changed in their behavior. They are now flying higher, they are flying faster, and they are more maneuverable. So this is clearly aimed. There we can see an interesting development in the military technology from the Russians. The Shahid were probably meant to fly pretty low, so they are less easy to be targeted by air defense and less by long range air defense. They are less easy to be seen on radar as they are flying lower. But with the Ukrainians now having switched over, first they have established a sensor system where they're simply using triangulation with microphones to identify where the Shahid are flying. So flying low to be below the radar horizon is completely pointless for them. And they have started to implement mobile fire groups. And for them, obviously, the closer the target is, the better for them, which means that lower flying Shahids are easier targets. And this seems that the Russians have learned from this. And now they said, okay, so they see us on radar if we fly higher, but it doesn't matter after all because they have us on their microphones anyways. But flying higher, flying more maneuverable, and flying faster will obviously make the Shahid drones a more difficult target for the Ukrainian fire teams on the ground that usually use 23 millimeter autocannons or heavy machine guns to down those drones. Then we have news from Krasnodar Krai. In Krasnodar, the bonus for signing a military contract has been increased from 1.2 to 1.5 million rubles with all boni, so from state, etc., from nationwide, it adds up to 2.3 million rubles that somebody gets if in Krasnodar Krai he's going to sign a contract with the Russian military. But while this shows that the Russians have trouble recruiting, apparently it is enough because Vitaly Panchushin or something like this on an article here in Army Inform is saying that the Russians are currently losing 1,200 men per day, but they are recruiting 36 to 38,000 a month. This is on the Ukrainian publications, showing that even the Ukrainians there claim that despite the rise in losses on the Russian side, the Russians are still capable of filling their demands. But we have to see 1,200 a day would be 36,000 a month, which would lead to a maximum surplus of 2,000 men. Doing again what I mentioned in my video about personnel trouble with manpower from the Russian side. The Russians are recruiting and they are recruiting well, but they are wasting them immediately and they are not building any sizable reserves. They are basically living from hand to mouth when it comes to their military personnel. On the Ukrainian side, we have some information as well. I had this on my German channel where some people wondered what happens to former prisoners of war. And Stanislav Arseyev is a journalist, author, and he fought as a volunteer on the Eastern Front and had really harrowing experiences there. Following him on Twitter when he reported from being struck with glide bombs, etc. So yeah, drastic reading in this regard. And he mentioned now what happens when you, having been released from captivity, Ukrainian laws allows you to demobilize. So this would be an answer to everyone who wondered to that point, what happens to Ukrainian prisoners of war if they are returned. So apparently they have the right to be demobilized. If they don't want to fight again, they don't have to. This was an interesting part for me to learn at this point. In the political sphere, we have some information as well. Russia will shoot 2 satellites into orbit for the Iranians. One will be an imaging satellite and one a communication satellite. Also, we have Zelensky presenting the victory plan for Ukraine. And he's basically making 5 different points. The immediately and unconditional invitation to NATO, military strength through domestic industry and improvement of military strength through domestic industry and foreign aid, then shoot down of Russian missiles and drones with partners, and the abolition of the limitations for Western weapons, and finally he also wants in-time satellite and intelligence informations, and Ukraine should receive a non-nuclear deterrence on its territory, and he wants economic strength through Western partners, they should be exploiting the resources and protect them. Ukraine in turn offers to use its experienced military to replace some US troops inside of Europe if this is wished as this. If we go through it, I guess it's the best that Zelensky can say at that point, but we have to draw some dire conclusions. We're obviously no longer talking about the reconquest of the territory that is currently occupied. Some of the quests, basically all of this is declined already in the past. An immediate invitation and unconditional invitation into NATO is not just unlikely, but that the invitation into NATO will be fulfilled in total, so that all the member states will sign off on Ukraine joining NATO. I do not see a realistic path to that. I think it's pure fantasy. Thinking about states like for instance Hungary signing off on it, and you have to see that it would invite a nation that is currently fighting a war against a nuclear power into the military alliance, and thus increasing the risk of military escalation in this regard. Whether all of the nations, currently it's easy to simply support Ukraine, but if it comes to the point where you would be bound by an alliance to the Ukrainians to help them with military aid in case of if something happens, while the Russians threaten them and while the Russians do nuclear saber rattling, seems highly unlikely, unfortunately. That the limitations on Western weapons will be dropped. There's nowhere on the horizon that this is happening. Domestic industry and foreign aid, okay, but shooting down Russian missiles and drones with the help of Western partners right now seems, as far as ever, that this is likely. Real-time satellite and intelligence would probably be interpreted as a direct entry into war, at least by some on the Russian side and by some on the Western side as well, as we, in quotation mark, would basically give the Ukrainians in real time where they should strike and thus give them targeting data. And this could definitely be interpreted by some as an intervention into the war itself in this regard. So this seems unlikely as well. Whether Western nations can exploit the resources is one thing, but whether they're protecting them is a different story, and that Ukraine has the manpower to actually offer to use its military power to take over jobs from the United States inside of Europe. I think at the same time, even if the war ends at that point, Ukraine will probably need all its manpower on the eastern flank, and the rest will be demobilized to allow for a recovery of the economy. So yeah, it's optimistic, but it shows the dire situation of the current state of war. I do not want to say anything worse about this, but it doesn't feel like this is a path to anything achievable at this point. Yeah, this is unfortunately the situation as we see it by now. But let's not end with a bad note, because there is good news after all. Finally, Australia has made the decision that it's going to give its old M1 Abrams to Ukraine. They are talking about M1A1. In total, Australia has 49 of them that are to be decommissioned, because Australia bought 75 new M1A2, so the newer versions, and they wanted to decommission those Abrams, and now they're going to give them to Ukraine. Some of them will need massive refurbishment, and the delivery of the new M1A2 has just started. So at which point those 49 will be handed over is unclear. Probably the Ukrainians might have some spare crew, as they've lost a fair number of Abrams, and not every time under the loss of all their crew. So some of them might be put into service pretty fast, but I would not expect the full amount of 49 to arrive before mid to end last year, even though it doesn't have to mean that parts of them are not coming earlier. But that was it already from me for now. Some good news, some bad news. I'm sorry for not being able to give you better news for Ukraine, as probably the majority of my viewership is pro-Ukrainian here. But if you still enjoyed this, or if you still liked what I did here, then I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment what do you think about the Ukrainian peace plan. Do you think it's somewhat realistic? And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.